Greetings, my name is Joe Rubenstein, and welcome to this week's edition of Bronx Bombers, which is even more jam-packed than usual because, well, no reason. We just like doing things like that. And if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Rate and review us, let us know how we're doing, but, be nice, because we're real sensitive here at Bronx Bombers, and if you say mean things, you might hurt our feelings. Hit us up on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. And by the way, we crossed that magic 1,000 follower threshold on our Facebook page on Sunday, basically on word of mouth alone, and we really can't thank you guys enough for following, for commenting, for sharing our posts. But hey, if you're not a social media guy or gal, you can send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up later on here in this episode, our Twitter poll this week, we asked who your favorite man in the booth is with Michael K. for Yankee Games on Yes. I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers on Betances. Also, a deep dive into the American League East as we size up the competition now just 2 weeks out of spring training. And it's one of my favorite Yankee podcasts, The Bronx Beat. And the man behind it, EJ Fagan, is going to join us. We'll hear part one of that conversation. But first, let's get you up to date with some news and notes from Mike Moreno. Mike, what do you got?
Well, the Yankees farm system remains one of the best in baseball, and one top prospect is hoping to make a big league impact in the very near future. Left-handed pitcher Justice Sheffield. Ranked as the Yankees' number 4 prospect overall and baseball's number 7 lefty pitching prospect, Sheffield performed well in the Arizona Fall League with 1 strikeout per inning. Although he was removed from his final start after taking a line drive to his left thigh, this was purely a precaution and Sheffield is healthy and ready to go for 2018. General Manager Brian Cashman has high hopes for the lefty, who along with right-hander Chance Adams and number 7 prospect Albert Abreu are the top 3 pitching prospects in the organization. At the major league level, the Yankees starting rotation appears set with Luis Severino, Masahiro Tanaka, CC Sabathia, Sonny Gray, and Jordan Montgomery. But in the event that one or more misses any playing time this season, the Yankees are well stocked with quality replacements, and fans can look forward to seeing some of these prospects in action this March, pitching in spring training games. And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
Well, coming off a storybook 2017 season, we're heading into a brand new story, and I think what Yankee fans are looking for most of all is a happier ending, because despite the fact that we far exceeded expectations, and I took a look at predictions from last year, none of the so-called experts had us finishing higher than 3rd in the division in 2017. But despite our great leap forward, I won't dwell on this, but those last 2 games in Minute Maid Park, let's face it, man, that was a nightmare. Just brutal to watch after those 3 big wins in the Bronx. Now, I don't know if the Houston clubhouse staff spiked the Yankee water supply with kryptonite or Ambien or what, but they were like the Walking Dead out there. And so just like that, the season was over, and in gut-wrenching fashion. And it's tempting, now that the sting of that loss has worn off, sort of, I hold on to these things. But, you start reflecting on just how big a step forward the 2017 season really was. It's tempting to fall into that magical thinking of, okay, so we got to the doorstep, lost in 7 to the eventual world champs, no shame in that. So the next logical step in 2018, especially given the Stanton trade, we advance one more step to the World Series and win. And I do think Yankee fans should be optimistic, cautiously optimistic, as I am, about our championship potential. But for the moment, I want to emphasize the cautious part because recent history hasn't necessarily been kind to League Championship Series losers the following year. I looked it up. In the last 10 years, only 1 out of 20 League Championship losers has gone on to win the World Series the following year. The 2016 Cubs, who lost to the Mets in the NLCS the prior year. But on the positive side, trend lines are made to be broken. Just ask the Cubs. So can the Yankees now, with a new manager and an upgraded lineup, handle the burden of preseason expectations, take that next step in 2018, and win it all for the first time in 8 years? Well, we start to find out for real on March 29th. And by the way, I realize that for other teams, 8 years without a World Series title is like nothing. I mean, look at the Cubs. The last time they'd won it, prior to 2016, the games weren't even on the radio that year because broadcast radio didn't even exist yet, guys. Now that's a drought. That's a Sahara Desert, epic level drought we can really respect. Cleveland hasn't won it all since 48, 1948, like when the A's were still in Philly and the Braves were still in Boston. The Mariners haven't even gotten there, and they've had some really good teams. I mean, 2001, they won 116 games, major league record, never got there. But, this is the Yankees, right? Not the Cubs, we're not the Indians, we're not the Mariners. And while it's true that 8 years may be nothing to the rest of the baseball universe, it is, in fact, the third longest drought between championships in franchise history, tied now with the drought between 2000 and 2009. And, since we're keeping it real here, roughly half the seasons here in the 21st century, we haven't even won our division, okay? And as we all know, division titles, pennants, championships, dynasties. That's the Yankee brand, for better or worse. And, when you fall short, that brand can bite back. So what stands between us and our regular season goals in 2018? Well, 19 other teams, that's what, and 4 of them we play more than the others. So right now, a lay of the land as we take a look at the American League East, examining where each team stands heading into a brand new season. And by the way, this isn't my official season preview. I'll do that in March. But spoiler alert, I will do these 5 teams in reverse order of where I think they'll end up in the division. So let's get right to it. First up, or maybe I should say last up, the Toronto Blue Jays, whose 2017 season was mediocre, started 1-9, finished in 4th place, 10 games under 500. And like a number of other teams, I would say Seattle, Texas, Baltimore, who we'll get to in a minute, sort of stuck in middling status, not a contender, but not rebuilding either. That said, the Blue Jays were the only team in our division to have a winning record against us in 2017, and that's got to change. It's an aging roster, and so injuries were a big problem in their starting rotation, but also Josh Donaldson, Russell Martin, Tulowitzki, all in their mid-30s now, and with the possible exception of Donaldson past their prime, all 3 spent quality time on the DL. Best pitcher was Marcus Stroman, I would say. I wouldn't call him an ace exactly, but Stroman and Aaron Sanchez, if healthy, that's a decent 1-2 at the top of the rotation, and J.A. Happ had an impressive year as well. Right fielder Jose Bautista was horrible, but he's now an unsigned free agent, one of many, and Toronto hasn't really signed a big bat to replace him in the outfield. I mean, yeah, they just signed Curtis Granderson last week to a 1-year deal. He's shown some pop in the past, but, he's 36, also past his prime. And so, despite the fact that the Jays scored the fewest runs in the American League last year, I mean, look up anemic on Wikipedia, you'll find a picture of the Blue Jays 2017 lineup. Team on-base percentage was .312. That's dismal, folks. But as things stand, Toronto fans in 2018 will see more or less the same anemic lineup returning, like, a legion of zombies. I mean, yeah, they also signed Yernervis Solarte, a switch-hitting infielder, who I liked on the Yankees. But if Solarte's their idea of a leadoff hitter, which they desperately need, by the way, then that's a giant fail because his career on base is .327, not good, and Granderson's isn't much better. So honestly, I think the Blue Jays are gearing up for another mediocre season. They are indeed my pick for last place, and I see an all-out fire sale in July as a real possibility. I'm sure they'll try to move Donaldson then, which they absolutely must get something for him in his walk year. If I was GM, I would have done it already. This team will not contend, and as I said, Donaldson was injured a lot last year, yes, but when he played, he showed he can still hit. I mean, between August 1st and the end of the season, he hit 22 home runs, so they absolutely must get something for Donaldson before he walks, hopefully prospects. So bottom line, after 2 ALCS appearances in a row, things got grim real fast up in Toronto last year, but before moving on, I'm going to take a sad song and make it better here. So one positive for the Jays is they have a bunch of really top-shelf prospects. In fact, Baseball America listed 2 of them in their top 10 last week, third baseman Vladimir Guerrero Jr. and shortstop Bo Bichette, and both those guys have been tearing it up in the minors. Next up, the Baltimore Orioles and their 2017 after a promising start. You know, it's easy to forget they were neck and neck with us the first 2 months of the season, but their year was a massive stinker, ended up dead last in the division with just 75 wins, 14 fewer than 2016. Pitching the real culprit here. The only team with arguably worse pitching in the American League was the Tigers, and that's what you call bad company. Some positives, Jonathan Scope had a breakout year with career highs in home runs and RBIs. Left fielder Trey Mancini, also good numbers. But yeah, the pitching was just a mess and just a ton of injuries. Chris Tillman, Zach Britton, both on the DL. And now Britton just last month ruptured his Achilles while he was working out in California, and he's going to be out for the first half of the season, which is a disaster. But let's face it, the pitchers that managed to stay healthy last year were awful. Kevin Gausman, Dylan Bundy, Ubaldo Jimenez, their starters combined for the worst team ERA in baseball at 5.70. And the additional drag for Baltimore fans is, unlike Toronto, their farm system is weak. I think just one pitching prospect that's played above single A. They have not been players on the international market. I mean, this century has not been kind to the Orioles. Just 2 playoff appearances. Best they could manage was getting swept by the Royals in the ALCS a few years ago. Attendance is way down. I mean, really, since Peter Angelos bought the team, their marketing and business decisions have been nothing short of a fiasco, and the Nationals, in short order, have absolutely stolen that market from under his nose. But if the Orioles want to address their pitching woes, only real option is the free agent market. Again, as with Toronto, I think a total rebuild is in order here. I'd do what the White Sox and the Tigers are doing, just unload and start from scratch. But Angelos will not do that. I mean, his decisions, again, have been so bizarre, I don't even trust him to make the obvious move and deal Manny Machado before the trading deadline. And while I'm piling on here, I think maybe the worst organizational tendency in the Angelos era is they give up way too fast on pitching prospects. So what happens is they trade them away just as they're finding themselves at the major league level, and then Orioles fans get to watch them blossom on some other team, which is a truly special torture. This is what happened with Jake Arrieta after they traded him to the Cubs, and then last season they traded Parker Bridwell to the Angels, where he pitched very well. Eduardo Rodriguez, who they also traded away, showed promise last year in Boston. So Angelos has done this repeatedly, traded away quality young pitchers who the Orioles could have controlled for years at low cost. So, if Albert Einstein is correct, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, then the Orioles front office is Crazy Town, USA, because they've been doing themselves in the same exact way throughout the Angelos era. And by the way, the reason I'm killing Angelos here, not the GM, Dan Duquette, is simple. By all reports, Angelos is the ultimate micromanager, just has to sign off on absolutely everything. Now, micromanaging isn't always a bad thing. It can work, but to combine micromanagement and incompetence is obviously a recipe for disaster. So forecasting 2018, given the fact that the Orioles need not one pitcher but 2, given the fact that they don't seem willing to rebuild, at least not yet, the free agent market, again, is their only possible route to a halfway decent season. They're probably looking at pitchers like Cobb, Lance Lynn, so guys like a cut below Darvish or Arrieta. And I hate to say this, but they probably end up overpaying a guy like Lance Lynn, who I think is overrated. And by the way, if there's any Baltimore fans listening, this isn't some drive-by troll job where I'm painting the bleakest possible picture out of spite or something. Honestly, I've never hated the Orioles like I hate the Red Sox. I'm not even close. And even if I did, I'd keep my remarks as objective as possible. But I do think that sadly for manager Buck Showalter and the Orioles' incredible shrinking fan base, I do think it's going to be a race to the bottom in the division between Baltimore and Toronto, and it's going to be neck and neck all the way down. Next up, the Rays, my choice for third place. Not a total disaster in 2017, sort of like Kansas City, I would say. A small market team with some real quality players that just underachieved. Although, to be fair, their record of 80 and 82 was a 12-win improvement over 2016. Evan Longoria, destroyer of Yankees, and for my money, the best player hands down in Tampa history. It's not even close. had another great year, and personally, I think all Yankee fans could not be happier that he's now a San Francisco Giant, so we don't have to watch him abuse Yankee pitchers anymore, and that goes double for CC Sabathia, who Longoria just has absolutely owned for years. I mean, owned with a capital O. No, actually, all caps, and tossed a few exclamation points on there at the end. In his career, Longoria has hit over 400 against CC with an OPS over 1,300. So, enjoy the hills of Frisco, Evan Longoria. You will not be missed. But the Rays, they have some sneaky good players. Kevin Kiermaier, Steven Souza, both just tremendous defensive outfielders. Logan Morrison had a good year, mostly in the first half. But for the second straight year, Chris Archer, who was their ace, I guess, wasn't great. ERA again over 4. But Tampa's sort of a reverse image of Baltimore. It's not really the pitching that killed them. It's the offense or lack thereof. Second to last in runs scored in the American League. So to field a competitive team in 2018, first order of business for GM Eric Neander, try to keep either Logan Morrison or Lucas Duda, both free agents now. Right-hander Alex Cobb, who I've always liked, also a free agent and will almost certainly go elsewhere for higher compensation. But, this is where small market teams can be really tough on their fans. You watch players like Cobb and Longoria develop into frontline talent, but then, of course, they've played their way out of your market because it's, small. So a guy like Cobb or a guy like Logan Morrison, I don't see them returning, given what they'll be offered elsewhere, even in this bizarre frozen market we're looking at right now. Now, the Rays do have some good prospects, like the Yankees, 6 in the top 100 according to Baseball America. So with their shoestring budget, they'll have to build from within, which is fine. It just takes a while. I don't see them being players in the free agent market much at all. And just like Toronto and Baltimore, if the Rays are out of the picture in July, I could definitely see them going total fire sale and starting from scratch. Personally, I think that's their best move. I do not see them contending in the division this year. Maybe the outer edges of the wild card race, if that. Moving on to the Red Sox, scrappy at times in 2017, a number of comeback wins, including a couple against the Yankees, but let's give Apple Watch a big assist, as the Red Sox got caught red-handed stealing signs against the Yankees using that device. For those who didn't follow this, back in September, the Yankees shared video evidence with Major League Baseball that the Red Sox training staff was getting information about our signs from video personnel and then relaying it to players on the bench via Apple Watch. And then Pedroia and I think one other player would pass that information on to Red Sox hitters. Now, for the record, sign stealing is as old as baseball. Absolutely everyone does it. And actually, the rules don't even prohibit sign stealing. However, they do prohibit the use of electronics to do so. But the Red Sox, their pitching was incredibly inconsistent, other than Sale, and then he imploded in the playoffs. Lineup never really scared you, not like it used to. A nice season. I mean, look, they won the division, so good for them, I guess, but they were clearly the worst division winner in the postseason, and that's not just a Yankee fan talking. The stats will back that up. And after adding arguably the best pitcher in the American League in Chris Sale, you'd figure they'd at least improve on their record from 2016. They didn't. Sale faded down the stretch, and again, after waiting 7 years for his first taste of playoff baseball, he was god-awful. In fact, his start in Game 1 of the ALDS by game score, 8-2, was the second worst postseason start by a Red Sox pitcher in franchise history. And of course, David Price was out a lot of the year with a bad elbow. Some decent appearances when he came back, but control issues. But again, offense was a problem. They had a bunch of guys that just underperformed. Betts, Bogarts, Pedroia, who's sort of the last man standing from their glory years. Last man hobbling, actually. He had major knee surgery in October, so he'll be missing the first 50 games of 2018. Hanley Ramirez, who occupies a big chunk of their payroll, was not good. Some bright spots. Benintendi had a very strong rookie year. I think he's going to be a really good player. The trades for Eduardo Nunez and Addison Reed were a net positive, although Nunez is now a free agent, and Reed signed with the Twins. Third baseman Rafael Devers showed some pop. But again, without Ortiz, their home run totals sank like a stone, just 168. That's 73 fewer than the Yankees, okay, who led the majors. Boston's team OPS bottom third as well. And then, of course, there was all the clubhouse drama. David Price, who's just a giant baby, vastly overpaid giant baby. Price manufactured this just ridiculous beef with Dennis Eckersley, of all people. Again, for those who didn't follow this, Nesson, which broadcasts the Red Sox, showed some bad stats during one of their broadcasts from a rehab outing by Eduardo Rodriguez, and Eckersley, who was calling the game, said yuck. That's it, yuck. And this one syllable so infuriated David Price that he confronted Eckersley as he was trying to board the team plane and threw an obscenity-laced tantrum, basically. Again, a giant baby, and this tantrum was literally applauded by a group of Red Sox who were standing around. I'm not inventing this. This was all reported on ESPN and elsewhere. I mean, come on, man. So he said yuck. Big deal. First of all, it wasn't about you. Second of all, the stats that Eckersley was responding to were gruesome. So to me, yuck is mild. Yuck is kind even. But for David Price, the $31 million baby, yuck was somehow just a bridge too far. I mean, Dennis Eckersley is a first ballot Hall of Famer, MVP, Cy Young Award winner, 6-time All-Star. I mean, show some freaking respect. You know what I'm saying? Respect your elders. I mean, given all the problems Price has been having as a pitcher, he should be picking Dennis Eckersley's brain, not going on an F-bomb tirade over some meaningless throwaway remark. Now, we'll get to announcing in some depth a little later on in this podcast, but I watched at least 2 Red Sox games last year with Eckersley doing color, and I thought he was really good. I mean, straight shooter, good insights. But again, this team plane incident, plus the Apple Watch hijinks and a couple other things, more than likely cost manager John Farrell his job, and so his replacement, Alex Cora, could be a good choice. But like Aaron Boone, an unknown quantity as a manager, and Boston's not dissimilar to New York in terms of the media frenzy. In fact, I think it's worse. So we'll see how Cora does with that when they start to lose. So as I mentioned last week, I was positive Boston would sign first baseman Eric Hosmer early this offseason. Mitch Moreland gave them nothing last year, but so far nothing doing. And again, that goes for a lot of free agents. I don't remember anything quite like this in my lifetime. There's more than 130 unsigned free agents with spring training literally right around the corner. But look, Boston does have a solid young core in Betts, Benintendi, and Devers, and they have money to spend, so they will certainly be competitive in 2018 and beyond. But unlike the Yankees, the Red Sox, with all their contractual obligations, will definitely exceed that luxury tax threshold this season unless they miraculously find a taker for one of their 3 biggest contracts, which would be David Price, Hanley Ramirez, Rick Porcello. Good luck with that. I mean, it's like the minute Theo Epstein walked out the door, they lost their minds. Terrible contracts. I mean, they're still paying the Kung Fu Panda, Pablo Escobar. And if you think the Ellsbury contract was bad, take a look at that Sandoval contract. Total horror show. $95 million. He gave them absolutely nothing. And so even though they released him last July and he's now a giant, the Kung Fu Panda is going to be cashing big fat Red Sox checks for the next couple of years out in California. So exceeding that threshold of $197 million, that's no joke. That's going to cost the Red Sox big time down the road in the form of a 20% tax hit or higher, depending on how far they exceed it. Now that tax hit, and they call it a tax, it's not really a tax. That's a misnomer. It's more of a surcharge. But about half that surcharge is distributed to teams who did not exceed the threshold. So in effect, the Red Sox will most likely be paying the Yankees, among others, a year from now, which should give all you Yankee fans a nice rosy glow. All of that said, I'm still picking Boston to finish second in the division, a weak division, but I think the Yankees will have first place all sewn up by September 21st or so. And yeah, I'm a Yankee fan. Yeah, totally biased. And yeah, I'd say the same exact thing even if I wasn't. Which brings us at last to our beloved Bombers. Well, beloved by some, but hated by others. But despite the fact that we fell short of our ultimate goal in 2017, a tremendous season, inspiring even, a very likable group, probably the most fun I've had personally following the team since '96. And it's no exaggeration or hype to say that we were an elite ball club in the American League in 2017. First in home runs, second in weighted on base average, which is, I know people on shows like this will often throw these stats around, these terms, without explaining what they actually mean. But I don't want to make any assumptions here. So simply put, the difference between an on-base percentage and a weighted on-base average, which when you see it printed, you'll see it by its initials, lowercase w, then all caps OBA, is that on-base percentage values each method of reaching base equally, whether it's a walk or a home run, counts the same, whereas a weighted on-base average assigns different values to each method of reaching base based on its impact on scoring runs. So for example, with weighted on-base average, a home run is valued or weighted more highly than a walk, walk. So in the final analysis, it's actually a better barometer of a player's value than an on-base percentage is. But anyway, the Yankees were second in weighted on base, third in ERA, second in WHIP, that's walks plus hits per innings pitched, and that's with Tanaka's horrendous start to the season. But more importantly, this was a coming out party for so many players, obviously Judge, Severino, but also Chad Green. Now Green, I'll be talking about at some length in an upcoming episode, because I think his rookie year was eclipsed, and understandably so, by that of Aaron Judge. But what Chad Green accomplished last season, in my opinion, has not been sufficiently praised. And of course, Hicks and Gardner, Didi, all had career years. Bullpen for the most part was killer. Plus, he's got some really great prospects, Gleyber Torres, Miguel Andujar, Chance Adams. And well beyond those guys, our farm system remains one of the very best in baseball, a real jewel, thanks to Cashman. So look, based on all that I've said, sizing up the American League East with Stanton added to the mix, I mean, there's no reason in the world why we shouldn't take all 4 season series within our division. And as for that opening series in Toronto, yeah, I know the first few games of the regular season are always ridiculously over-magnified. I mean, this isn't college football where it's 12 games and goodbye. There's 162 of these suckers. And the Yankees historically have actually started some of their best seasons, championship seasons, slow out of the gate. But even so, I'll be taking a hard look at that opening series in Toronto. Here's why. Because those are the ones, those series against lesser opponents, where if you take care of business throughout the season, maybe come October, you get a Game 7 in the Bronx instead of Minute Maid Park. Home field, baby. Home field.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of these 4 players caught Dave Righetti's no-hitter on July 4th, 1983? Was it A. Cliff Johnson, B. Rick Cerrone, C. Butch Weiniger, or D. Mike Stanley? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
We're joined this week on Bronx Bombers by E.J. Fagan, who is the host of the Bronx Beat podcast, which is one of the go-to destinations for really smart, data-based Yankee analysis. I'm a subscriber, and I highly recommend it. EJ blogs about the team as well, and he does these things while also working towards his PhD in political science, which is kind of impressive. EJ, it's a pleasure having you with us today. How are you?
Doing great, and thanks. That's high praise.
Now, before we get to current events, and there's a lot to get to, but for those that are listening, I'm wondering how far back you go with the Yankees. Now, I'm a bit older than you, so as a kid, I grew up in the era of those 70s teams with Munson and Chambliss and Reggie Jackson, but I'm curious, when did your Yankee fandom begin? And then how did you get involved with writing and podcasting about the team?
Yeah, so I'm 30 years old. So I grew up in the best time to be a kid Yankee fan, the late 90s. So I got a little bit spoiled right there, but I'm from Jersey. My father is a big Yankee fan. My mother's actually a big Red Sox fan. She's from New England. So that was tough growing up, and or at least it was tough for her growing up, I think. But I got into that, and it was more of a hockey household than a baseball household, and I was more of a casual fan until I read Moneyball. I think I read Moneyball in 2003, 2004. And it kind of like a light bulb went off in my head. And not only about baseball, I mean, I saw baseball a completely different way, and I began actually becoming a real intense follower of the sport. But just it changed the way I think about life, and I can probably trace a straight line from that to the PhD in political science.
Really? Tell us more about that. What's the connection between Moneyball and political science?
Sure. I mean, so political science is a social science. It's a statistics, econometrics-based discipline. When I started understanding the world from a statistical point of view, I did that through baseball. I didn't really have any idea of what political science was at the time. And as things went on, that became my worldview. I became a data-based observer of politics, and I was always interested in politics. But it took a while for me to realize that you can make a career out of being someone who studies data in politics. But I learned all of that from baseball. I got my first job in politics. It's actually like a paid internship because I was a blogger about baseball. I had been blogging all through college. I decided I wanted to maybe become a sports writer. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Decided eventually that wasn't for me, but all that work I did with showing people that not only could I write online, but I could edit a website and I could run numbers. Appealed to the political employers that I was trying to get a job with, and 6 years later, I decided to go to grad school, and now I've got 4 years of Jedi statistics training under my belt, which now feeds back onto baseball. Now that informs more baseball.
You know, something I've been thinking about a lot, EJ, as I've been launching this podcast, is how to find that balance between, on the one hand, being a diehard fan, but then also providing objective analysis, which is kind of tricky. So I'm wondering if you ever find it difficult to wear both those hats at the same time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So here's a story I'm going to tell. This is the Christmas family story, and most people have horror stories on other subjects. I have a horror story on sports. And that is, my parents are diehard, massive New Jersey Devils fans. The New Jersey Devils, when I went home for Christmas, were in first place. However, when you read the data are fairly clear that the New Jersey Devils are probably a below-average team, and they've been very lucky to get into first place. And I made the mistake of communicating this to my parents before the Devils went on like a 6-game winning streak. And so every time the Devils would score a goal over Christmas break while I was home enjoying my time with my family, my father would say that was a lucky goal. I stand by the analysis, and I think that I'm also a huge Devils fan, but I think that I can set my expectations accurately using data. The nice thing about baseball is once you get past the 162-game season and you get to the playoffs, the data says that it's basically just a crapshoot. The probability of winning is not that much different than random chance. So then at that point, you can just sit back and say, look, we made the playoffs. We think this is a pretty good team. Let's just watch it and have fun. And that I can also take that perspective.
I mean, that's what makes that first series, that divisional series, so tense, because it's only 5 games, so it's even more of a crapshoot.
Yeah, right. Or that 1-game playoff. I was lucky enough. I flew back to New York. My father really wanted to go see the 1-game playoff, and flying me back was his excuse to go see that playoff. And I flew back to it, and I was a wreck during that game. It was awesome. It was fun, but it was tough. But I loved it and could still enjoy it as a fan.
Yeah, well, the good thing was that after Severino came out and gave up those 3 runs, the Yankees came right back in the bottom of the first. So our suffering was time limited, but it was definitely a nail biter.
Yeah, that was a day. But they came back and they went on to a fun playoff. And although they lost in Game 7 of the ALCS, I think that at that point I just really felt like I was playing with house money. This is a team that I probably was fairly low on going into the season. I think I probably predicted 84, 85 wins on the podcast. And, you know, when they come up and win, 90 games I think they won this year, and make it to the Game 7 of the ALCS, at that point you just got to say we had a great year, and this just makes me happy. And I think had they won this year, I think this coming season where we get to watch Judge and Stanton hit 500-foot home runs would be a little bit less fun. And so I'm enjoying the slow ramp up. And then I'll enjoy the dynasty for the next 6 years.
All right, let's switch gears and get to the latest news. Obviously, on the pitching front, Tanaka staying in the Bronx and the return of CC Sabathia on a 1-year deal, those are big stories. We traded Chase Headley to clear space, but the 2 biggest moves for the Yankees this offseason came early. The replacement of Joe Girardi with Aaron Boone, and then something really nobody saw coming, at least I didn't, the trade for Giancarlo Stanton, where the Yankees gave up 2 very expendable prospects in Jose Devers and pitcher Jorge Guzman, who, I'll be honest, EJ, I'd never heard of Guzman before this trade. Just another masterpiece by GM Brian Cashman, who, think about this, EJ. Cashman somehow managed to engineer a deal where the Yankees will spend roughly the same amount on the combination of Giancarlo Stanton, the reigning National League MVP, and most likely Gleyber Torres at second base, than they did last season on the combination of Matt Holliday and Starlin Castro.
Well, they're going to have a cap hit roughly equal to A-Rod's salary last year.
That's exactly right. So let's start there. With Stanton, we know about the power he brings, but how do you see this playing out positionally? Will it be mostly Stanton at DH, since Judge is a marginally better right fielder, an even split with Judge at DH? Are we going to see one of those 2 guys in left? Give us your crystal ball prediction as far as how the outfield plays out defensively and the DH position as well.
All right, so my bet is that they acquire someone to get some DH time on top of this. I think the person who's probably going to lose net playing time, is Brett Gardner from this whole situation, which is good. He's an older player. He probably should be resting more anyway. He probably should be sitting more often against lefties, and luckily everybody on the team's a right-hander, so that's fairly easy. I suspect that Aaron Judge, who's faster than I think people give him credit for, at least has, once he's under speed, is pretty fast, is going to see a decent amount of time in left field as a result. But if you ask me who's like the best possible lineup, who plays in Game 7 of the ALCS against some random pitcher, I'm probably going to say it's going to be Stanton at DH, Judge at right field, Gardner in left field.
Now, I want to paraphrase a couple of points you made in your podcast when talking about Stanton, which are, number one, people worry about Stanton having missed a bunch of time in his young career due to injury. But really, these weren't the kind of recurring chronic injuries that fans should necessarily be overly worried about. These are really kind of fluky injuries that don't indicate much of anything about his durability. That's number one. And number two, in the 2017 season where hitters were striking out at a record pace, you pointed out that Stanton actually cut his strikeout rate from 30% to 24%, which, considering he hit 59 home runs, is pretty impressive. And when you add the fact that, according to Baseball Prospectus, Marlins Park was the 7th most difficult home run hitting park for righty hitters last season, and Yankee Stadium was the 2nd most favorable, I mean, is this Murderer's Row 2.0, EJ? I mean, talk about the potential of this Yankee lineup.
Yes, I think it is Murderer's Row 2.0. I think I wrote a blog post on BP Bronx, which is the site I blog at now. And the argument I made was that people, the phrase I used was, people refer to Murderer's Row way too often, but in this case, it actually might be justified. You're talking about probably the 2 best home run hitters in baseball batting potentially back-to-back. You're talking about a guy like Gary Sanchez, who, let's put it this way. So Brandon McCarthy was on the Pozcast, a podcast with Joe Posnanski and Mike Schur, Brandon McCarthy, former Yankees pitcher, and was asked basically this question. The question was basically, how afraid should the rest of the league be? And he said, oh man, we've got Didi, and they've got Greg Bird, and they've got all these great players. And he went on for about 3 minutes about how scary the Yankee lineup is, and he forgot to mention Gary Sanchez existed. That's how good this lineup is. Right, it's a lineup that you could just forget that Gary Sanchez, potential 40 home run catcher, is there and is going to be, would have been as scary as basically anybody but Giancarlo Stanton protecting Aaron Judge next year. And now they're both going to be protecting Aaron Judge. So all those walks that pitchers were handing to Aaron Judge, that they thought that they could, they could put him on base and pitch to Didi Gregorius or someone after that. There's going to be 2 of the best home run hitters in the game knocking in those runs, right? Aaron Judge is going to jog into home plate quite a lot, and I like that a lot. And that also means that they're going to have to throw him strikes, and he's going to be able to be as selective as he was in the early part of the season. And just thinking about it is awesome. I mean, it is wonderful to think about. And I want to make one more point that people have been making, I think, a rather dumb argument about Giancarlo Stanton ballparks that you mentioned. So they kind of do the simple thing where they lay over his spray chart on Marlins Park. That was made in Marlins Park and put on Yankee Stadium, and show accurately that the walls of Yankee Stadium aren't close enough in to give him any more home runs last year or the last couple of years. And I think that's just the wrong way to think about this. Number one, Marlins Park is a fairly large ballpark, and that's one of the reasons why it's a pitcher's park. It also has some pretty bad atmospheric conditions. It's a humid place. It's the same reason why the old ballpark wasn't a very great place to hit. It's the same reason why places like Arizona or Colorado, which are actually fairly large ballparks, are really good places to hit. Yankee Stadium, the ball will fly farther in Yankee Stadium than it did in Marlins Park, and that's a good thing for Giancarlo Stanton. Also, I don't care how far Giancarlo Stanton hits the ball, and he hits the ball very far, he is going to have some balls which go to the warning track. We're going to see those throughout the season. And on the margin, he will gain home runs, in an infinite number of playthroughs in Yankee Stadium versus Marlins Park, and it cannot be a bad thing for Giancarlo Stanton, even as a right-handed hitter.
Now, the Yankees as a team hit 241 home runs in 2017. That's with Bird playing only 48 games, Sanchez playing only 122. Very little production from the DH position with Chris Carter and Matt Holliday, and then Headley and Ellsbury in the playoffs. That was basically a black hole. Now, the team record for home runs in a single season is 264 by the Mariners in 1997, which means we only need 24 additional home runs to beat that record. So with Giancarlo Stanton added now to a hopefully healthier group in 2018, would you care to make a prediction as far as the Yankees breaking that Mariners record, EJ?
So I think 300 is reasonable.
Wow.
It's not likely, but it's reasonable. This question cannot be answered until I know who's playing second and third base, and that really will impact it quite a bit. I think that you're probably going to see some home runs come back from guys like Didi Gregorius, guys like someone like even Brett Gardner will probably hit fewer home runs next year. Stanton will hit a lot more home runs next year, and that will make up for it. But the Yankees are losing some home runs from Starlin Castro, et cetera, from Matt Holliday. So I'm not going to say it's a certainty like some people are saying. I probably said right after the trade. But the Yankees could set the home run record next year. That's pretty cool.
EJ Fagan from the Bronx Beat podcast is our guest this week on Bronx Bombers. Now, as far as the Aaron Boone hire, there were some naysayers, myself not included. I think for better or worse, we're seeing a sea change in the role of the major league manager where they're no longer CEOs but middle managers, and Boone fits right into that. But certainly the big knock is that he has no managing or coaching experience. And of course, there's the open question of can he handle the heat in New York as far as the fans and the media, given the skyrocketing expectations around this team. Those are some of the talking points. Now, I know you were lukewarm on this hire, at least initially, and you made the very fair point that maybe a Hensley Mullins or Rob Thompson would have been, to put it bluntly, ready and willing yes men to the front office while also bringing some experience to the table. Has your view on this Aaron Boone hiring changed in the last month or so as you've allowed it to sink in, EJ?
You know, I don't know how to evaluate the Aaron Boone hiring. Before Aaron Boone was hired, my take was I like experience and I like somebody who's hired because of nothing to do with their relationship to the Yankees or their name or their baseball history. I like the idea of hiring Mullins. I like the idea of hiring Woodward. I like the idea of hiring those kind of guys who I think are young and progressive baseball people, but also have experience in major league clubhouses and coaching roles and all of that. Aaron Boone is a broadcaster. Most recently, he was a player. He came from a baseball family. There's a lot to like about Aaron Boone, and so far he's said all the right things. But if you ask me again, I would say I still think that experience is important, and especially in the age where the role of managers are is changing. I think that those progressive teams like Chris Woodward and the Dodgers is what I look to for that next manager. I think that I think Gabe Kapler was a great hire by the Phillies, and I think that Chris Woodward, whatever team he ends up with, or if he doesn't go back to the Dodgers, will be a good hire right there. Aaron Boone might secretly be a stat head. He might secretly be this progressive, and I just don't know how to judge that. The Last Jedi, the new Star Wars movie, had kind of like a subtle message in here that you should trust the boring, experienced person and not like the hotshot, young gun, sexy guy. I like boring, and I think Aaron Boone is a little too exciting for me right now. Hopefully, I'm wrong, and I don't think he's a terrible hire. I think a terrible hire would have been like Ron Gardenhire or something. But I think he's probably, from the outside, not a wonderful hire still.
Now, another remark you made on your podcast, the Bronx Beat podcast, right after the Boone hiring, and this I agreed with, is that given his lack of experience, it would benefit the Yankees to hire a bench coach with some experience, Tony Pena, for example. Now, obviously, the Yankees went in a different direction and hired 39-year-old Josh Bard, former catcher, bullpen coach for the Dodgers last couple of years. Now, I know Bard and Boone were teammates on the Indians, so that may have played into it. But one thing Bard was known for as a player, in fact, the only reason he played at all as a career .254 hitter was his defensive prowess, which in over 4,200 innings, he only allowed 26 passed balls. That's phenomenal. Do you think it's possible, given some of the well-documented struggles with pitch blocking that Sanchez has had, that the defensive catching aspect of Josh Bard's resume may have factored in here as well?
So I'm going to say probably not. The Yankees have catching coordinators, and maybe they're looking for someone on the staff who has some catching experience, and Josh Bard might be that guy who does who works with catchers a little bit. But I don't think that's what you hire your primary bench coach for. I think that what is happening with Josh Bard is the same thing that has happened with Chris Woodward, happened with Gabe Kapler, and that is everybody taking all that information that the Dodgers have accrued and just stealing it and saying, "Oh no, I'm going to buy the expertise right out of the Dodgers. They're the smartest team in baseball, and they want that kind of information." He was their bullpen coach. The Dodgers are doing some very interesting things with pitching. I think that's what he's brought on for. He's brought on for the next wave of pitching and defense that the Dodgers are capable of doing. If he was the Dodgers catching coach, I might agree with you, but he was the Dodgers bullpen coach, and that is interesting.
That's EJ Fagan. You just heard the first part of that conversation, and you can hear part 2 of that interview on the next episode of Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Who caught Dave Righetti's no-hitter on July 4th, 1983? The answer? C. Butch Weiniger. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Who is your favorite broadcast partner with Michael Kay on the Yes Network? And 36% of you said Paul O'Neill, 30% for Al Leiter, 24% David Cohn, 10% Ken Singleton. That ordering sounds more or less right to me. Personally, I would switch O'Neill and Leiter. I'd put Al in that top spot. Big fan, as a player and a commentator. I mean, I'm a big fan in general of having a pitcher do color commentary. But beyond his pitching insights, Al's got a great delivery. He somehow manages to be high energy without being hyper, which is no easy trick. Very conversational, sort of like Keith Hernandez in that regard. Just natural. But look, the others all have their strengths. I think O'Neill, out of the four, probably has the best chemistry with Kay. I think Coney is the most up-to-date on advanced metrics. I think Singleton can talk hitting with the best of them, and man, was he a great hitter. I remember as a kid absolutely dreading his at-bats against the Yankees when we played Baltimore. But as an announcer, I don't know. Something about his voice just puts me to sleep. And on the days when Kay isn't there and Singleton does play-by-play, the emotion when the Yankees get a big hit just is not there. Or at least it never sounds genuine the way it does with, John Sterling, for example. Although Sterling, he's become kind of a parody of himself with the whole Gardy goes Yardy customized home run calls. Just kind of embarrassing, really. And that's probably a minority view, which is fine. But what's that one he does for Didi? Oh, yes, indeedy. Gregorius makes Yankee fans euphorious. Okay, first of all, euphorious, not a word. And even if it is, it really shouldn't be because nobody says it. And second of all, just please stop. I mean, plenty of positives with Sterling, and they certainly outweigh the negatives. Great voice. I would say even the best in the business. And real honest-to-God charisma, which is a very rare thing, actually, and can't be learned. But John, please check your glasses, because if I had a nickel for every time I heard it is high, it is far, it is caught the last few years, I could buy, well, not much, actually. A nickel doesn't go very far these days, but maybe a subway ride. But I do consider myself a kind of aficionado of baseball announcers, and I think they have a really important job, especially in a slower-moving game with less consistent action than the other major sports. And by the way, there's a really great site called awfulannouncing.com. Highly recommend it. They sort of take a snarky view of sports media in general, but every year they do a poll of all the fan bases and list their rankings of broadcasters for all 30 major league teams, along with their own commentary, and it's really interesting. I'm an MLB.com subscriber, so I get all the games, and if the Yankees aren't on and I'm home, I'll often check out other teams, and believe it or not, I'll decide what team to watch based on who their announcers are. So just off the top here, to give you my personal top three, first I would put the guys that do the Giants. I'd put the Orioles second, and then probably the Mets. And the three to absolutely avoid at all costs are first and foremost the White Sox. The dude who calls those games, he calls himself the Hawk. Ken Harrelson, the Hawk. He's just, please, I beg of you, for your own good, pass. Hard pass on the Hawk. And this isn't just me. This is a guy who is routinely judged to be the worst announcer in baseball, maybe in baseball history. GQ magazine summed it up nicely. I found this quote. Where is it? Listening to Hawk is just an immensely grating experience, and it is only compounded by his attempts at folksiness. He's also an unbearable homer, and he totally is. Let's be honest, a little bias on the part of the announcers for the home team, that's inevitable. Michael Kay doesn't call opposing teams home runs with nearly the same enthusiasm that he uses for the Yankees, and nor should he. But this guy, this Hawk, he takes it to a level we've never seen it before. He is just insanely, unapologetically biased. The Hawk is out there actively rooting for the White Sox, and his catchphrases make Sterling's Didi home run call sound like Shakespeare. Just a seemingly endless supply of cringe-worthy catchphrases from the Hawk. Just for example, he literally calls the White Sox the good guys. I am not making this up. So when they score, he'll say, 1-0 good guys. How do you like that? And if the White Sox rally, he'll say, don't stop now, boys. Bottom line, be careful out there, because if you make the dubious decision to listen to the Hawk call a White Sox game, you will feel your IQ drop like a point a minute. And to add insult to injury, he stated publicly that he will never retire. That's right, never. I mean, he's like one of those loud, obnoxious guys who's deluded himself into thinking he's the life of the party, when in fact, everyone is secretly scheming on how to get him to leave. Although, come to think of it, I did read recently that the White Sox are reducing the number of games he calls this year, so good for them. And the guys who do the Nationals, not as blatantly offensive as the Hawk, but quietly bad in their own way. I forget their names and I have zero interest in looking it up, but their style... It's like the operative definition of generic corporate sports broadcasting. Totally pre-programmed. Like, if you went out and shelled out a bunch of dough for a pair of really high-end androids and then programmed them to call Nationals games, you'd get the same result. I mean, actually, it would probably be an improvement based on the novelty factor alone. And third worst, the guys who do the Cardinals, same issue, no personality, which is a shame for such a storied franchise. But getting back to my top three, Keith Hernandez and Gary Cohen, who call the Mets, I'd maybe sneak them into second place, but the price you pay, of course, for listening to those guys, you have to watch the Mets, or as a Mets fan friend of mine calls them, the Mutts. But Hernandez, a little unfiltered, but I like that. Really articulate, but those crazy digressions he goes on, I remember a few years ago, the Mets were I think they were in the middle of a rally, and here's Keith Hernandez giving this really long, really detailed review of an off-Broadway play he'd just seen about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was hilarious. You could just see you could close your eyes and see the producers blowing a gasket, and it was just great. And for the Orioles, Gary Thorne, fantastic. Super smart, funny, great voice, which, I don't know, maybe it's the musician side of me, but the voice to me matters. And Jim Palmer as his partner, a little mellow stylistically, but I've learned a number of things about pitching, specifically pitch selection and the decision-making that goes into it, just listening to Palmer. But the two guys that do the San Francisco Giants, Dwayne Kuiper and Mike Krukow are their names, are to my mind the best in the business. Just great chemistry, that kind of dry humor with just a tinge of sarcasm that I love, and that works really well for baseball. Relaxed, well-informed, former players themselves. And again, they obviously enjoy each other's company, which you really can't fake that. All right, from this week's mailbag, Nikki in Syosset writes via email, is Dellin Betances the modern-day Mark Wohlers? Oh, man. I hope not, Nikki. I really do. And for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with the whole Mark Wohlers saga, this is a story worth going into. A bit of a horror story, actually. So Mark Wohlers came up in 91 with the Braves organization and emerged as one of the very best closers in the game in the mid-90s. He was a big part of the Braves' 95 championship, and he could really bring the heat. In fact, he set the record for the fastest recorded pitch at 103 miles an hour sometime in the mid-90s. Of course, Chapman now holds that record at, I think, 105.1 miles an hour. But Mark Wohlers was pretty much automatic there for a while, until Game 4 of the 96 World Series against the Yankees, when he served up a 2-2 slider to Jimmy Leyritz, who took it over the left field wall, and not only tied the game, which the Yankees eventually won, but really helped turn that whole series around after David Cohn's masterful performance in Game 3 had stabilized it, following 2 games in the Bronx where the Yankees just got absolutely boot stomped. But what Nikki's question actually refers to is late-stage Wohlers, because after that 96 season, he had an ongoing issue with control problems, extreme control problems. Now, it wasn't immediate. He still had stretches in 97 where he was effective, so in all likelihood, that Leyritz home run had nothing to do with it. But whatever the cause, or combination of causes, his command steadily deteriorated, as did his confidence, to the point where a lot of the time he seemed to have absolutely no idea where his fastball was going. I mean, at times it would sail like 5 or 6 feet over the batter's head, and at other times it would bounce several feet in front of the batter. And it might sound funny, but believe me, it wasn't. And so this thing just fed on itself in a vicious circle. Failure can feed on itself just like success can. And, it's tough. As the great philosopher Yogi Berra once said, 90% of this game is half mental, right? But this slow motion disaster that was Mark Wohlers in 98 it was very big news, national news. It was this bizarre mystery of how can an all-star caliber pitcher in perfect physical health lose his ability to pitch. And by the way, that's how the Braves actually put it. When the Braves at one point put him on the DL, teams are required to list a medical reason when they assign someone to the DL. And so the formal reason the Braves entered was inability to pitch. So at this point, this has taken on the dimensions of something out of like a Franz Kafka story. And of course, everybody and their brother had a theory on what he needed to do to snap out of it. Everything from changes in mechanics to hypnosis, nothing worked. And so during the course of that 98 season, which was actually an amazing season for those who followed it, you had all these feel-good stories. Obviously, the Yankees' runaway success ending up setting a franchise record with 114 wins. Plus, you had Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa battling it out to see who would be the new home run king. But then in the background, there's this like sinister subplot of this guy, and a good guy, very humble guy, grew up dirt poor. But here's this pitcher, falling apart on the national stage. But look, we all know Wohlers wasn't the first. This has happened to other pitchers. Steve Blass won 19 games for the Pirates in 1972 and then completely lost the strike zone after that. Unlike Wohlers, Blass didn't have any success at all after that 72 season. I think he won a total of 3 more games after that, and then boom, out of baseball. Steve Blass, nice knowing you. And position players too. Dale Murphy started out as a catcher for the Braves in the 70s, and then suddenly lost the ability to make accurate return tosses to the pitcher. They would end up in center field. So he had to transform himself into an outfielder, which he did very well. And then, of course, Yankee fans will recall back in 2000, second baseman Chuck Knobloch suddenly couldn't make an accurate throw to first. It was totally bizarre. Because here was a guy who was a really good fielder for the Twins. I think Gold Glove. Yeah, Gold Glove in 97. I remember one game in the Bronx during that 2000 season. I think it was against the White Sox. Knobloch made 3 throwing errors to first base, and they weren't just slightly off. The ball was ending up like in another zip code. Until finally he just had it. He checked out. Really, he took himself out of the game and rolled out of Yankee Stadium in his street clothes while the game was still going on, which has caused a big stir at the time. And he never really got the throwing back, really. Torre ended up using him at the DH position quite a bit, actually. But anyway, what happened with Wohlers was the Braves traded him to the Reds, I believe, and then they put him on the DL with an anxiety disorder. And, he bounced around to a couple of teams after that. Actually, he was on the Yankees for a couple of months, but he never got back on track. And there's no question this was psychological. I'll let the man speak for himself. I found this article online from back in 98, right in the middle of all of this. And it's from the New York Times. And here's Wohlers himself talking about it. Quote, "In the past, if I walked a few guys, I would just go, oh man, bad night. Let me go home and wake up tomorrow and start again. Now I overanalyze. Why did this happen? What was I thinking? Believe me, nobody can say anything worse about me than what I'm saying about myself. I know I'm my own worst critic. I know I don't cut myself any slack. But the only way I'm going to get where I want to be is go out and keep pitching, and I know it means going out and embarrassing myself," unquote. So obviously, this is a guy going through a very tough situation, dealing with things for which there are no metrics. He was also going through a divorce at the time, and his mother also had a major heart attack during all of this. And then a few years ago, his house burned down, for real. If I changed the name and a couple of minor details and presented this story to you as a fictional screenplay, you would say, no way, man, start over. It's totally implausible. That many hellacious things just don't happen to one guy. But they did. This guy cannot catch a break. But with Betances, no, I don't see it, Nikki. We're not there yet. Not even close. I get it. He had a frustrating year. There's no denying it. Pitched well at times, just way too many walks. Let's see. Pitched almost 14 fewer innings in 2017 than he did in 2016, despite the deep playoff run, because Girardi just was not comfortable going to him, and for good reason. Here, in 2017, despite that lighter workload I just mentioned, Betances issued 44 walks compared to only 28 in 2016. So yes, there were control issues, severe at times, hit batsmen, pitches sailing over the batter's head like a Mark Wohlers, but to say he's the modern-day Mark Wohlers, we're just not there yet, Nikki. Let's not forget, 2 years ago, he was arguably the most dominant reliever in baseball, with one of the highest strikeout rates. We're talking elite stuff. Now, you might say, yeah, but Joe, you could have said the same thing about Wohlers in 98. Which is true, but, it would have been wrong to give up on Wohlers back in 98, just like it's wrong to give up on Betances now. We just don't have enough data yet, and he's too young and too talented to just write him off because of a bad stretch. And considering how good he can be, let's give him the benefit of the doubt for now, Nikki, and worst case scenario, and he continues to have issues. Look, it's far from ideal, but we have a whole battalion of quality arms in the bullpen to offset that. So cause for concern, yes. but I wouldn't get too worked up about it because with our bullpen, he's practically expendable. But thanks, that's a great question. Want to thank everybody for tuning in again this week to Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. Share it with everybody you know, friends, loved ones, even total strangers. Why not? But most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.